Thanks for coming to tonight's event, which is sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote intellectual diversity here at OU, but also to provide a forum where important issues can be debated in a reasonable way. Tonight's lecture, like all Washington Forum events, is not made possible by public funds or your student fees. That's the football team, but by the generous donations of OU alumni and staff, and by grants and foundations. Tonight's speaker is Steve Pincus. He's the Bradford and Durfee Professor of History at Yale University, where he's also the co-director of the Center for Historical Inquiry and Social Sciences. He got his PhD from Harvard University after completing his undergrad degree at Dartmouth, before coming to Yale, where he's a professor of history at the University of Chicago. He's written dozens of articles and a handful of books. His first books were Protestantism and Patriotism, Ideologies in the Making of English Foreign Policy, 1650 to 1688, and 1688, the first modern revolution, which came out of Yale University Press in 2009. His latest book is The Heart of the Declaration, the Founder's Case for an Activist Government, which just is out in the last year. Pincus is a historian who tries to relate his scholarly work of the past to contemporary issues. And what especially distinguishes his efforts to do this is that his works are neither simple or stupid. His arguments are empirically driven, theoretically sophisticated, and abundantly clear. Agree or disagree, and I think it's fair to say Pincus doesn't mind a bit of argument and a rough and tumble. You'll never not know what it is that he's arguing or why he's chosen to argue. Tonight's lecture draws from his most recent book on the Declaration of Independence. And most Americans and more Straussians focus on the document's second paragraph, in which it's declared as self-evidently true that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Others think that the Declaration's most important chunk is the first paragraph, in which it's asserted that independence is actually declared. Pincus, by contrast, if I read him correctly, thinks that the long list of colonial grievances was really the heart of the matter, and moreover, that this has important implications currently for American government. He's here tonight to explain why he thinks that's the case, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming him to Ohio University.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Robert, and to the George Washington Forum. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And, you know, on a July evening like tonight, or at least the weather seems like a July evening, it seems entirely appropriate to talk about the heart of the Declaration. And I should point out that there's going to be large chunks of this talk where I'm going to ask you to sing along. So this is just to, you know, get you ready for that. So the heart of the Declaration. Now, we at the small collegiate school in New Haven think we have a certain propriety over the Declaration of Independence. This is the image of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which sits in the Yale Art Gallery, and like all things in the Yale Art Gallery, of course, it had to have been painted by a Yale alumnus, so this is John Trumbull's image of the Declaration. Now, of course, there's a much bigger version of this painting, which sits in the National Gallery in Washington, but we at Yale like to forget about that and say that this is the most important image about the Declaration of Independence. So the question that I want to ask about, not about the painting, but about the Declaration in general, is a question which I think generations of historians on both sides of the Atlantic have asked. Why did the North American colonies break away from the British Empire in the 1770s? Now, to sort of motivate and explain why I think it's important to ask this question now, is that I think the assumptions on which most of the scholarship has answered this question, at least British historians no longer believe. So most of the scholarship on the American Revolution assumed two things about Britain. First, that Britain was unique among Europeans in having a weak or liberal state. It had no state. It was, absolutist countries on the continent like France, like Spain, even Sweden had a big state, but Britain had a very small, a very weak state. That's the assumption which sort of pervades most of the historiography on the American Revolution, including books on the American Revolution, like a book, a bestseller published last year by Alan Taylor, makes is exactly this claim that Britain always had a weak state. But you can say that on this side of the Atlantic. Nobody on that side of the Atlantic sort of who deals with British historical scholarship would say this anymore. Second, it's assumed that British politics in the 18th century was devoid of ideology and partisan divisions. Now this, of course, was a claim which a very famous British historian, not a British historian of British descent, but nevertheless a British historian by the name of Sir Lewis Namier made famously in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and it was sort of appropriated into American historical scholarship in the 1950s and 1960s by one of my teachers, Bud Balin, who just emailed me before to ask me some impertinent questions, but there it is. I won't talk about what Bud had to say today. And Edmund Morgan, who was one of my predecessors at Yale. They sort of brought this interpretation. Now, this was sort of au courant, up-to-date British historiography in the 1950s when they brought it in. Unfortunately, while it's still a claim which is made over and over again in the American historiography about the American Revolution, this is an argument that most British historians sort of got rid of about 25 years ago. So I want to ask, what does it matter that British historians now think that Britain in the 18th century had a very strong state, perhaps a stronger state than any of its European counterparts, and that in fact British politics in the 18th century was in fact riven by ideological division and party politics? What does it matter that if we bring these two elements back into the story? Well, I think that by doing this, you start rejecting the usual answers which are provided to what the American Revolution was about, why the American Revolution happened. Now, it should be said that these usual answers, and you can see they're very sophisticated answers, the usual answers cut across the ideological divide. This is not something which is a left-right, Republican, Democrat disagreement in the historiography. So Merrill Jensen, a progressive historian, argued that the American Revolution was a revolt against the centralized coercive power of Great Britain and the colonial aristocracy, right? So it was about Britain trying to impose its state, this newfound state, in the 1760s on America, and the Americans didn't like it, so the revolution was about getting rid of the state. Gordon Wood, who could not be accused of agreeing with Merrill Jensen about any political issue, argued that it was a Republican revolution against the corrupt British state. Patriots, American patriots that is, tended to see society as beneficial and government as malevolent. So it was a revolution, in Gordon Wood's view, against government or against the state. And Jack Green, who disagrees with both Wood and Jensen about just about everything except for this, said it was a constitutional revolution of the periphery against the core, that is to say, by the North American colonies, the periphery against the core, London and Britain, in favor of limited government. So across the ideological spectrum, left, right, center, there's a view that the American Revolution was a revolution against the state. So predictably enough, I disagree with all of them, and that's the point of what I'm going to try to say now. So it's a puzzling question. It's been a puzzling question for me why it was that the North American colonists would have wanted to get rid of the British state because, in fact, the British state was unusually nice to its colonies. So Britain devoted far more resources to colonial development than the French and Spanish empires, by a long shot. So let me just give you some data, data that just appeared in an article that I published with an economist at the University of Chicago in a French journal last year. So Spain, Russia, the Holy Roman Empire spent over 90% of all of the revenue, 90% of its revenue on warfare. France and the Dutch Republic spent about 80% of its revenue on warfare. Britain, by contrast, spent only about 65% of its revenue on warfare, right? That's a pretty big increment, right? 65% versus 90%, and Russia was actually more like 96%. So this is a pretty big increment. So the question then became, what did British spend its money on? Well, it turns out that it spent very little of this increment, of this extra money that it had to spend in England. Local initiatives covered most of what was going on in England. So if you wanted to build a turnpike in England, Parliament passed an act and said, you're allowed to build a turnpike between, say, Worcester and Cheltenham, to take one example from the 18th century. You can override property rights to build this road, but we're not going to give you any money. You have to raise the money to build it. So the government didn't spend any money on building the roads. So very little of this money was spent in England. Most of the money, it turns out, was spent in the colonies and in Scotland and Ireland. And part of what I want to hint at is that Scotland and Ireland in the 18th century were actually treated much like colonies. It was spent, above all, on subsidizing immigration. So the British government spent huge amounts of money, tens of thousands of pounds year by year, subsidizing immigration, French Huguenots, Palatines, Salzburgers from Germany, convicts, and it turns out, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a little while, Italians also to come to places like North America, the West Indies, and others of their colonies. They spent a huge amount of money on developing trades in the colonies, on tar, lumber, shipbuilding, growing flax for linen, and they gave this sort of money in something called bounties. And they provided disaster relief. So when Charleston, South Carolina burnt to the ground in 1740, it was the British government that put up a large part of the money to rebuild Charleston in 1740. So when you go and visit those nice 18th century buildings in Charleston, you have the British government to thank for it. And I think it's important to realize that comparatively, there was a huge difference in the way that the various European empires dealt with disaster relief. So we have a great natural experiment, as social scientists like to talk about. In the 1780s, there were hurricanes. So hurricanes are equal opportunity disasters, right? They don't pay too much attention to national boundaries. So there was a hurricane in 1781 that did huge damage to Saint-Domingue, what's now Haiti, did huge damage to Jamaica, and did huge damage to Cuba. And it did huge damage to the sort of capital cities. In Saint-Domingue, the French government provided a certain amount of tax relief to Saint-Domingue. They said, okay, you guys don't have to pay quite as much taxes this year. In Spain, in Cuba, the Spanish government did absolutely nothing. In Jamaica, the British government rebuilt Kingston with government funds. So we know that the British government, spent quite a lot of much more money on the colonies, and they also spent a lot of money on infrastructure, on building roads, on building harbors, on doing all sorts of things, also supporting the post office. In fact, we know there was a huge amount of money on building roads in New Jersey. In fact, they built this road that went through Fort Lee, and there's still, rumor has it, some traffic problems in Fort Lee because they didn't quite make the road long enough, although they're wide enough, although there might have been some other reasons why there's traffic problems in Fort Lee. So the puzzle that George Washington, that I want to sort of introduce based on this, the fact that is that the British government actually spent a lot of money on colonial development. They did a lot more to help the North American colonies than their imperial rivals. So why did the British Americans want to get rid of the British government, British overlordship? This seems to be a puzzle. And it's even more of a puzzle when one realizes what happens when George Washington received his copy of the Declaration of Independence on a warm July night like tonight. So Washington received news of the Declaration of Independence. He received a letter from John Hancock, the president of the Second Continental Congress, who was in Philadelphia. He sent a copy of the Declaration of Independence to George Washington, who's sitting up in the northern end of Manhattan, and he's sitting up in the northern end of Manhattan with his troops while General Howe is disembarking the British Redcoat, thousands of British redcoats on Staten Island. So he can see them from Washington Heights, see the British redcoats disembarking. He knows that battle's about to happen. And of course, he gets the Declaration of Independence and immediately rides out on horseback to his troops and reads the Declaration of Independence. And then he provided his troops a gloss on the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. He said, see, after having read the Declaration of Independence, what we are fighting for, our aim was to secure that freedom and those privileges guaranteed by the British Constitution. Okay, let me repeat this image. He's got his troops. He's about to fight the British Army, the British Redcoats, and he says he's fighting on behalf of the British Constitution. What did he mean? Why did he think what he was fighting for was the British Constitution? That's the puzzle that I really want to try to explain today. What were the privileges and freedoms guaranteed by the British Constitution that Washington thought he was defending? And why go to war against the British to guarantee the British Constitution, the rights and privileges of the British Constitution for Americans? Why do you have to fight the British to guarantee the British Constitution would hold in America? Well, The way to understand this in the sort of overview of the argument is to sort of go over what the Patriot position was. First, the Patriots believed that a central part of the British Constitution, the Constitution that they were importing into North America, was to subsidize immigration to support the development of colonial economies. You needed people to develop the economy, they said. Second, they thought it was absolutely important for there to be state support of trade to support colonial dynamism, just like the bounties that the British government had been giving to develop a colonial industry or colonial agriculture. They thought it was necessary to increase popular participation in politics so as to maximize political information, mostly about economic and social situation. And fourth, they thought it was absolutely essential to eliminate the slave trade and slavery for economic and moral reasons. So the Patriots developed a political economy of state-supported growth in response to the debt crises of the 18th century. Now, we tend to think of debt crises as a relatively recent phenomenon. We all know that there was this big debt crisis in 2008, and we tend to think of debt crises as a late 20th century and an early 21st century phenomenon. But in fact, debt was the fundamental political economic issue of the 18th century. So when I did a survey hired by the French government to do a survey of political economic literature in the 18th century, because there was this great collection of political and economic literature at the University of Poitiers. I did a survey, and what was remarkable is something like 85% of the political and economic literature published all throughout Europe in any language in the 18th century dealt with the issue of sovereign debt, of what we would call sovereign debt. This was the big issue, and periodically throughout the 18th century, European governments had debt crises, some of which are very famous. You've probably heard of the South Sea Bubble. Any of you who've taken, a basic economics class, Paul Samuelson has one of his big examples of irrational investment has to do with the South Sea Bubble. There was also a Mississippi bubble crisis. And of course, anybody who's studied the French Revolution knows that there was this huge debt crisis in the 1780s, which led Louis XVI to call the National Assembly, and so began the French Revolution. So debt crises were a fundamental problem in the 18th century. And patriots argued that the best way to solve a debt crisis was to stimulate the economy, was to spend your way out. They rejected the notion accepted by most Europeans that the economic crisis was brought on by too much spending by nations living beyond their means. Now, I wish I could say that this quote came from an 18th century source, but actually, of course, this comes from Paul Krugman in the New York Times in 2015. Now let me turn to George Washington. Now that's an image of George Washington's Mount Vernon in the 18th century. Now there are a few key things missing from this image, like slaves, for example. But this is a wonderful image of Mount Vernon. And the question that I sort of ask myself is, why did George Washington call it Mount Vernon? Why did the Washingtons call their family estate Mount Vernon? Well, the answer can be found in George Washington's papers. On his return from Cartagena, George Washington's older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, called his patrimonial mansion Mount Vernon in honor of the admiral of that name with whom he had contracted a particular intimacy. Now, this is slightly puzzling because the admiral of that name, Edward Vernon, who we're going to talk about in just a minute, with whom he contracted a particular intimacy and with whom Lawrence Washington had served, had just overseen one of the greatest British naval disasters of the 18th century. So, you could understand Lawrence Washington calling his estate after, some great naval hero, right? After somebody he just fought a great naval victory with. But he just named it after somebody who oversaw one of the greatest naval disasters in which something like 70% of the North Americans who had volunteered to serve with Vernon's fleet died in the attempt to take Cartagena. So this is slightly puzzling. It can't be because he's celebrating Vernon's naval victory. And what I want to suggest to you is that the key to understanding why Mount Vernon got its name, and also understanding the nature of the Declaration of Independence, is to understand the nature of the patriotism with a capital P, which was espoused by Lawrence Washington and Admiral Edward Vernon. Their patriotism, I want to suggest, was focused less on abstract philosophical claims to rights than in an argument about political economy, on the proper relationship between the state and the economy. And it was that version of patriotism which motivated Lawrence's admiring younger brother George and played a significant role in shaping the Declaration of Independence. So who was Admiral Vernon? Well, he was an admiral, obviously. He was the son of a radical Whig, James Vernon, who himself who was a revolutionary. He'd taken up arms to overthrow King James II in 1688, and then James Vernon became Secretary of State to the new revolutionary regime. Edward himself was an experienced naval officer. In the 1720s and 1730s, became known as a radical or patriot critic of the conservative Whig Prime Minister Robert Walpole. And in fact, Edward Vernon made his name in a famous speech in Parliament in 1728. In 1726, the British had gotten involved in a small naval war with the Spanish, and a senior admiral had gone to besiege Portobello, which is now on the coast of Panama. Robert Walpole, the prime minister, never gave the orders to attack. So Hozier, sitting out there in the Caribbean with his ships, with no order to attack Portobello, and as happened to many people in the 18th century, they were struck by yellow fever, and most of the people on the fleet died. In fact, Admiral Hozier himself died. So Vernon, in a spate of patriotic fury, got up in the House of Commons and said, any naval officer worth his worth, any politician worth his worth could have taken this town of Portobello, this fortified, rich Spanish town, with 6 ships only. To which Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, who was no small man, he was about 6'4", 350, 400 pounds, large guy, he just sits there and starts laughing, and immediately all of his supporters in the House of Commons start laughing. And young Edward Vernon runs out of the House of Commons with his tail between his legs, terribly embarrassed. Well, in 1739, the Walpole government is forced, for various complicated reasons that I won't go into, to start a new war with the Spanish, and Edward Vernon is given a command. Edward Vernon then sails with 6 ships and attacks Portobello in November 1739 and takes it with 6 ships only, at which point he became instantly a national hero. And here's one of the many popular images of Admiral Vernon taking Portobello with the requisite 6 ships. After the victory was in Portobello, everybody was sort of celebrating this. So we can think of Portobello Road in London. It's funny how little one thinks about Admiral Vernon and Portobello Road in London, but nevertheless, Portobello Road in London in Notting Hill was named after Vernon. The Portobello section of Edinburgh and the Portobello Barracks in Dublin were all named to commemorate this great victory. And instantly, Vernon becomes a national hero. There were coins made to celebrate his victory. There were plates made to celebrate his victory, and there was some really, really bad poetry written to commemorate his victory. Here's a ballad on the taking of Portobello. Here's English courage displayed, and in fact, there was even a mock epic called the Vernoniad, which I assume everybody at Ohio University English literature courses are forced to read to celebrate the taking of Portobello and Vernon's great achievement. But in all of this literature, Vernon was celebrated above all as one thing, as a patriot, as the new song of 1740 referred to the patriot crew. And when Vernon died in 1757, the London Evening Post appropriately waited to publish his obituary until the 5th of November, a national day of celebration in Britain still today. On the 5th of November, he was commemorated and described as an honest patriot. So why was Vernon's patriotism so attractive to Lawrence Washington? Well, part of it is because he was opposed to the political economic program of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. And here you can see the hugeness of Walpole himself, although he does seem to have rather small hands, but I don't know what that's about. But Walpole, so what was Walpole's imperial political economy? Well, he believed that wealth was based on production by human labor, free or unfree. This is Walpole's position. And he thought that the most valuable British colonial possessions were sugar colonies based on slave labor. He thought it was important to avoid subsidizing immigration because Britain had a huge national debt. Subsidizing immigration was an unnecessary expenditure of money. It was much cheaper, rather than to subsidize people to populate the New World, than to get labor, and to rely on the slave trade. They thought that they should avoid spending on supporting manufacturers or protecting markets because this would be very expensive. And all of this was because Britain had a huge national debt. In the Caribbean, this meant several things. It meant you want to avoid war with France and Spain, so you want to negotiate tensions. And the way that Walpole negotiated away tensions was to pay so-called subsidies, which was basically bribing the French and Spanish governments not to go to war. He wanted to support something called the South Sea Company. Now, the South Sea Company was created at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession it was created just before the end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1711, and it was given a monopoly and the exclusive right to send 1 or 2 ships a year into Spanish America. So the Spanish Empire in the 18th century had prevented any non-Spaniards from trading with the Spanish Empire. And this was a big problem because the wealthiest overseas American provinces that any empire had were Mexico and Peru. Why were they so wealthy? Because of the silver mines in Mexico and Peru. All of the other Europeans wanted to get access to the silver mines. The Spanish wanted to retain their monopoly over silver, but they allowed the South Sea Company, as a result of having been defeated in the War of the Spanish Succession, to send 2 ships into Spanish America, selling British manufactured goods and slaves. Now, the South Sea Company created a factory, which was basically a business office in Kingston, Jamaica, to collect the goods that were going to be sold into Spanish America. The British government, got a huge cut of a huge percentage of what the profits from the South Sea Company trading into Spanish America, which gave the government an incentive to prevent all other trade with Spanish America, because anybody else trading with Spanish America would necessarily lower the price of British manufactured goods in Spanish America. So the government had a huge incentive to round up any British Britons living in the West Indies selling goods illicitly into Spanish America. And they called those people who were illicitly selling goods into Spanish America in the 1720s and 1730s pirates. Now, you probably have this romantic vision, I don't know where you could have gotten, of pirates in the Caribbean, of being these sort of handsome, dashing figures who might or might not look like Johnny Depp, who did all sorts of deeds of daring do. But the pirates of the Caribbean of the 1720s and 1730s were probably not so dashing. They were merchants trying to sell British manufactured goods into Spanish America, and they were attacked in the first instance not by the Spaniards, but by the British Navy trying to prevent them selling goods illicitly into Spanish America. So the Patriots, Vernon's party, disliked this position, and they announced their opposition to this position in 2 wildly popular newspapers, The Craftsman and Common Sense. Tom Paine, you've probably heard of, wrote this pamphlet in 1776 called Common Sense. Why did he call it Common Sense? It's because he was so deeply impressed by the success of this radical patriot newspaper from the 1730s and 40s called Common Sense. And Common Sense, we know, was distributed everywhere in North America and the West Indies, was widely read in a variety of places. So what was the political economic position announced in these journals and in other places? Well, they believed that infinite economic growth, that is to say, perpetual economic growth, was only possible through the interplay of production and consumption. So the Walpoleans believed in a political economy which emphasized production alone. The Patriots argued that it was necessary to have the creative interplay of production and consumption. Laborers needed to be able to buy things to drive economic growth. So they wanted, above all, a high-wage economy. They believed, of course, that manufacturers did indeed produce wealth, but manufacturers weren't going to produce wealth unless they had people to buy their goods, right? So you needed consumers to drive manufacturing production. So what did this mean in terms of policy? It meant first that the goal of British policy should be to pry open Spanish American markets to British manufactured goods, not to allow the South Sea Company to have a monopoly of selling 2 ships a year, but to be flooding Spanish American markets with British manufactured goods. Now, this was a good idea because in the 18th century, not only did the Spanish have these incredibly wealthy silver mines, but the production from these silver mines were going up, which meant that the Spanish government was systematically driving the indigenous people, the people who were producing low-end manufactured goods, low-end textiles into the mines, which meant that demand in Spanish America for European manufactured textiles was exploding. They thought slave economies or slave societies made no sense because slaves were not good consumers. No plantation owner worth his salt was going to buy a new suit of clothes for his slave, to keep up with the fashions, with the London fashions, right? So they were not going to be good consumers. They thought also it was useful, therefore, to subsidize immigration to the New World to create more consumers. And they thought that consumers needed to have a voice in political decisions to tell people, to tell government what in fact they needed, to tell manufacturers what they needed, and therefore they wanted broader participation in government. So over and over again, the Patriots talked about the value of consumption. So John Trenchard in Cato's letters, after which the Cato Institute is named, said, nothing can free mankind from the drudgery of a subsistence agrarian life than the invention of arts and sciences, since it was only consumer demand that would induce people to believe that other things are necessary to their happiness, already a key word in political argument in the 1720s, besides those which nature has made necessary, he reasoned. The luxury of the rich becomes the bread of the poor. In other words, the more consumer demand you have, the more purchasing you get, the better off everybody is going to be. And so the Jamaican patriot James Knight argued that trade with Spanish America was once the chief support of the island of Jamaica, nor can it otherwise subsist without being a very considerable expense to Great Britain. Why a considerable expense to Great Britain? Because if Jamaica became a sugar monoculture with slaves, there were going to be endemic slave rebellions. And who was going to put down these slave rebellions? The British Army, paid for by the British government. So that was incredibly expensive. It was much more economically efficient, in fact, to trade with Spanish America rather than to become a sugar monoculture, and that was what James Knight argued. And Cadwallader Colden, the New York patriot, said, labor and manufactures have become the basis of all trade without which it cannot be carried on. It were better for the country if there were no Negroes in it, and that all could be carried on by free men who have a greater interest in the promoting of the good of the country and who strengthen it more than any number of slaves can do. Again, this sort of argument that you get political participation and you get consumption when you don't have slaves. So Vernon's goals, Edward Vernon's goals, the Patriot Admiral, was to put an end to Spanish attacks on British trade and to free up trade with Spanish America, to seize one key port, and his idea was to seize Havana, that would force the Spanish to open trade to the British. But above all, he saw the French as the greatest threat. So he didn't want to seize Spanish territory. He wanted to pry open Spanish-American markets, and he feared the French for this reason. This is something that's sort of little appreciated. This was what a map of British America looked like in the middle of the 18th century. These little red bits are the British bits. These big, scary blue bits are the bits that the French controlled, right? So for British Americans were terribly worried, and for good reason, that these blue bits were going to drive the red bits into the Atlantic Ocean. So Vernon, when he's sitting before trying to attack Cartagena in 1741, delivers this amazing speech to his troops, right? They're besieging a Spanish port protected by Spanish soldiers. And he says, the French, gentlemen, the French are our most dangerous and most inveterate enemies. I cannot look upon their settlements in these seas without apprehension that I heartily wish were groundless. The riches of the universe in Spanish hands is not half so much to be apprehended as trade in those of the French. And if the Spanish were disarmed at sea, that trade would be at our mercy. So the goal was to disarm the Spanish, penetrate their markets, and kick the French out. Now, his elder brother, James, played a significant role in all of this as well. So James Vernon was one of the original trustees settling the new colony of Georgia, founded in 1733. And this is the Georgia trustees in an idealized dinner that they were supposedly having with the Yamasee Indians in London. This never happened, but this is how they imagined things should be. But Georgia, it needs to be understood, was a patriot colony. The goal was to develop a colony that would produce and manufacture key materials with British government subsidies like silk and cotton. It outlawed, the first law of Georgia outlawed slavery, so slavery was illegal in the founding constitutional documents of Georgia, to guarantee a consumer population and to shift the costs away from defense against slave rebellions, which they thought were ruining South Carolina, into economic development. And Vernon, James Vernon, used his political ties to have the state fund the settlement of Palatine refugees, Swiss Huguenots, Scottish Highlanders, and Italians into Georgia. Now, why Italians into Georgia? Because Vernon was convinced Georgia would become one of the greatest wine-producing regions of the world, and who better to grow wine than Italians? They also thought there was a possibility for olive oil, and of course, we're all buying Georgian olive oil today. So why did Lawrence Washington adore Vernon and the Patriots? It's because they had a vision for colonial development with state support rather than extracting wealth from the colonies. Their goal was to pry open Spanish American markets that would supply North America with currency, right? In 18th century North America, there was no currency. When you went to the store in Charleston, in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, and you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, you paid for that loaf of bread with a Spanish piece of 8, which was not milled in a British mint, but was milled in Spanish mints, and the only way you could get that coin was to trade with Spanish America. And they thought the Patriots would protect North America from French encirclement. So that was the Patriot vision, and Georgia was the model Patriot province. But in 1746, Admiral Vernon was dismissed. This gallant man, Edward Vernon, this lover of his country, was called from his command in the Downs, was struck off the list of admirals, and never was employed anymore, said his obituary. And he was dismissed by the Admiralty Commission. And the person who was behind his dismissal was none other than this guy. Now, you probably aren't all immediately certain who this guy is. I had to visit this guy every day for a year when my kids went to the Christ Church Cathedral School in Oxford. This is a portrait which sits in the dining hall at Christ Church College in Oxford. You probably know the dining hall as the dining hall at Hogwarts, which is what it's used to film. But it was the dining hall at Christ Church, and he was, this man was one of the most famous alumni of the college. This is none other than George Grenville, who was on the Admiralty Commission that dismissed Vernon. And here I'm quoting, this is a story which Dr. Kinkle, as I guess we have to call her now, as Sarah had developed in her doctoral dissertation, shows that there was a series of naval reforms in 1745, 1746, which were organized by George Grenville, his friend John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, and John Russell, the 4th Duke of Bedford. And I'm not sure this is really what happened, or this is just what Sarah sort of imagined how a classroom should function, but it's a notion that you needed to increase discipline, you needed to have hierarchy, you needed to have standardization, and you needed to have centralized command. That's what the naval reform sort of called for. They wanted to extend martial law onto the mainland so they could prevent any seamen from running away. And all of this, Vernon ran afoul. In fact, he often ran his own way in battle. Vernon sort of believed that the best way to fight a naval battle was to run misdirection plays. He would send, most of the fleet, he was command most of his fleet, and say the battle's going to be this way, and he would sail the other way. This was kind of his strategy. He was kind of it's kind of like a running back on a football team who sort of, sends all the blockers one way and goes the other way and hopes that he can outrun the defense. That was sort of Vernon's strategy. This was not exactly how things were supposed to work under Grenville, under the naval reforms, the so-called Anson reforms of 1745-46, and so Vernon was dismissed. Now, when Vernon died, this great monument was planned to be erected in Westminster Abbey, and this is a picture I took in Westminster Abbey this summer. Now, it was erected in Westminster Abbey as a great form of political protest. It was erected in 1763, the year that George Grenville became Prime Minister, and it was funded by patriot political opponents of George Grenville, celebrating, this great man Vernon, who he had dismissed from office. So, what was George Grenville's political program when he became Prime Minister? Why were the patriots so upset with him to spend thousands of pounds erecting this beautiful monument in Westminster Abbey? Well, basically, George Grenville's economic program was Walpole's economic program on steroids, right? It was based on the same principles, but with more urgency. Why more urgency? Because after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the British debt had become the largest national sovereign debt in human history. Right? So Grenville thought it was really, really time to tighten the belts, to pursue austerity measures, and to cut back. Right? That's what he wanted to do, and he saw the colonies as a great source of extraction and revenue. And in fact, unlike his predecessors, the Patriot prime ministers, had a great preference for the sugar colonies of production as opposed to the North American colonies for consumption. As he frequently was supposed to have said, "I see absolutely no purpose in keeping such useless colonies as Little Connecticut and smaller Rhode Island." And you can imagine at Yale, we don't like people saying things like that. So his practical measures were to use the reformed navy to prevent all trade with Spanish America and French colonies. Now, this became a real problem for the new British colony of West Florida. Right? So West Florida, faces the Caribbean, and the idea was to use Pensacola to ship British manufactured goods into Spanish America. So initially in 1763, people bought up land in Pensacola for huge sums of money because they thought they would sort of participate in this new shipping boom. But Grenville thought it was a bad idea to trade with Spanish America and with the French colonies, so he stationed the British Navy to prevent any trade between Pensacola and Spanish America, which meant no trade was taking place, which meant that all these people who had invested in land in West Florida within 2 years were selling their land in West Florida for pennies on the pound. So it was a complete disaster, which created a lot of upset British investors. He passed the Sugar Act, which forced taxes on foreign sugar to benefit the Caribbean sugar colonies. He passed the Currency Act to prevent issuing paper money. Issuing paper money is basically betting on the future economic growth, right? You issue paper money, and you get taxes in the future to pay back the money. So it's an investment on future economic growth. And by stopping the issuing of paper money, he effectively stopped development in the colonies because there was now no liquidity. There was now no money circulating in the colonies. He ended support for immigrants to North America and the West Indies. They come to a grinding halt. The 10,000 pounds or so a year that was being used to subsidize immigration ends in 1763. And, of course, he famously passed something called the Stamp Act, which you probably all read about in high school textbooks. Now, there was massive patriot opposition to this. Patriot opposition on both sides of the Atlantic. And, in fact, one of the leading patriots was this guy. Right? You all know who this is, right? Yeah, well, it turns out this is actually a beautiful statue that used to sit on Wall Street in New York. And it now sits in the New York Historical Society. So when I visited the New York Historical Society 3 years ago, I asked, where was this statue of this famous guy? And they said, oh, we don't have it, only to discover that it's sitting there in the front room of the New York Historical Society. So this is William Pitt, the Patriot Prime Minister, and he lost his head not because of some action, by enraged American patriots, but by the British Redcoats occupying Manhattan in 1776, who beheaded him because he was a patriot opponent of the policies pursued by the then Prime Minister, Lord North. There was massive protests in Britain. British merchants, there were mass petitioning campaign. Tens of thousands of people in Britain itself protested against this series of measures pursued by Grenville. There were speeches in Parliament by leading patriots, including Isaac Barré, Henry Seymour Conway, William Pitt, and all the other guys after whom towns in British North America were named. And there was a simple claim: colonial development and consumption of British manufacturers would pay down the debt far faster than enacting this piddling little tax on North America. And of course, the same argument was advanced by North Americans and West Indians. So no taxation without representation, the great cry, was not a complaint about taxation, but a constitutional argument on behalf of political economic reform. We need representation so we can have a more rational set of political economic arguments, one which would tax at the point of production rather than at the point of consumption. And there were widespread complaints about the political economic program adopted by Grenville. And it was described at the time as un-British, inconsistent with the British Constitution. So we're already beginning to see the language that George Washington would adopt. Anyway, there were lots of complaints in New York City, in Freedom Hall and Federal Hall in October 1765, which led to the so-called Stamp Act resolutions that, in fact, while it's normally said it complains about the Stamp Act, but in fact, it said that the problem was that as the profits of the trade of these colonies, in other words, buying British manufactured goods, ultimately center in Great Britain to pay for the manufactures which they are obliged to take from thence, they eventually contribute very largely to all supplies granted there to the Crown. In other words, it was an argument not against taxation, but for a different kind of taxation, that they would pay down the debt much more quickly by buying British manufactured goods which were taxed at the point of production. And this was the argument which this relatively little-known guy, George Washington, made in a series of letters in the 1760s to his radical merchant friends in London. Certain it is our whole substance is already, this is George Washington, in a manner flow to Great Britain, and that whatsoever contributes to lessen our importations must be hurtful to their manufactures. Having the commercial system of these colonies put upon a more enlarged and extensive footing than it is, because I am well satisfied that it would ultimately redound to the advantages of the mother country, Britain, so long as the colonies pursue trade and agriculture and would be an effectual let to manufacturing among themselves. The money, therefore, which they raise would center in Great Britain, as certain as the needle would settle at the poles. In other words, much better not to tax the colonies directly, have indirect taxation. It would pay down the debt much more quickly. So the debate that was going on in the 1760s was not a debate over taxation. It wasn't a tax revolt, as so many American historians have assumed, but in fact it was a clash about a debate over different kinds of empire. It was a debate between patriots and Grenvillian Walpolean system, a debate, that was what the debate was about. It was a debate between an extractive empire, the notion that the mother country should tax the colonies directly, versus the developmental imperial state that would indirectly tax the empire. Neither side in this debate were anti-colonial. Grenville and Walpole wanted Britain to follow French and Spanish models of empire, whereas the patriots wanted them to follow a distinctively British model of empire. They wanted a state-supported development. So let's now turn to the Declaration of Independence. Now, nobody would doubt that the Declaration of Independence is the ultimate patriot document. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that it is the touchstone of patriotism today. What they misunderstand is that patriotism in the 18th century referred to a political party, not to nationalism, some vague sense of nationalism. But they overemphasized exactly the part that Robert read out to you. That read out to you correctly, saying that I was going to say that that wasn't terribly important, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, blah, 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 blah. General abstract principles, things that we can talk about with no knowledge of the historical context. We know basically what they mean. Unfortunately, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's a tiny fraction of the document, right? It's this little bit right here. So why did these brilliant founders of ours go on for so much longer, right? Why, what was the point about going on? Well, the point about going on for so much longer was to develop a patriot political program. So the document begins as an indictment of the government of George III. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let fact be submitted to a candid world. Now, think about what this means for a second. It means that up until 1760, up until George III came to the crown, the British Empire was a happy place. It was working, from their perspective, it was great, it was to be admired, it was to be distinguished from the French and the Spanish empires, which is why British Americans were the most enthusiastic supporters of the crown during the 7 Years' War. They thought the British Empire was doing great things. And of course it was. It was providing all these subsidies, it was providing a unique amount of development. So in the Declaration, our first constitutional document. The Declaration of Independence is the first constitutional document in American history. It is the touchstone of our Constitution, I would say. In the document, they complain about George III for having prevented immigration. He, George III, has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, that is to say, he got rid of the old subsidies for immigration, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. This infuriated the Patriots. It was madness in the extreme to attempt to diminish the population of North America. Were these men, these plantations, these cities trebled, the profits would center in Great Britain and add so much and much more to her strength and opulence, argued Arthur Lee of Virginia. And this argument was repeated by every single patriot, including Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, because he was from New Haven, the most important of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, even Thomas Jefferson. Second, America's fundamental constitutional document is a pro-immigrant document. Second, they complained, the founders in the Declaration of Independence complained about preventing trade with Spanish America. They complained about cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, right? This is what Grenville did, this is what North continued to do, to prevent trade with Spanish America, to prevent trade with French America. The colonists depended on trade with Spanish America to gain coin because they had no coin of their own. And in fact, what was central to their program was to promote free trade, right? Central to the founders' arguments were to promote free trade. Now, free trade in the 18th century isn't necessarily, an idealized form of free trade that some economists would like to have, but it was freer trade. It meant taking off barriers to make it easier to trade with other people. Third, they talked about slavery. And the clause which referred to slavery in the Declaration was, he, George III, has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Now, distinguished professor at Stanford, who shall remain nameless to protect the innocent, said, who knows what this is about? We don't know what this is about. It's really difficult. We can't figure out what this is about. This is the vaguest statement. We don't know what this is. Now, it might be if you didn't read things like Thomas Jefferson's writings. So Thomas Jefferson in 1774 had blamed George III for rejecting colonial anti-slavery laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies. They had made repeated attempts to put an end to the slave trade. All of these were defeated by His Majesty's negative. So when they're complaining about George III vetoing legislation, it's anti-slavery legislation, which the colonists have been complaining about for a long time, that George III had been preventing. And just to give you, I could go on for about 30 minutes giving examples of this, but I'll just give you from one sample from the Newport Mercury. The chief justices of both North and South Carolina are interesting themselves against the traffic. This essay, he continued. The people of Maryland are also roused on this matter. The assemblies of Pennsylvania and New Jersey are applied to by petition from a great number of the inhabitants of those provinces. The Assembly of New York passed an act laying a duty on any further importation of slaves, but it was refused by the royal governor. Connecticut hath prohibited any further importation, and ordered all that may be born in the colony to be free. And the Massachusetts Assembly passed an act at their last session prohibiting any further importation in order that none should be bought or sold in the colony, and all born after to be free, but it was negatived by the governor. In other words, there was a massive anti-slavery movement in North America in the 1770s, and of course what they never tell you is that in April 1776, the Second Continental Congress banned the importation of slaves. Right? It's in the journals of the Second Continental Congress, not unfortunately in the textbooks. But above all, the Declaration of Independence was about creating a state. So when John Adams celebrated the adoption of the Declaration of Independence to his wife, Abigail Adams, and remember, John Adams was one of the Committee of Five who drew up the Declaration of Independence, he only quoted one clause in the Declaration of Independence. Not the clause that all the Straussians say that we should pay attention to, but this clause, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and as such they have and of right ought to have full power to make war, conclude peace, and look at this phrase, establish commerce. Make commerce. The state needed to intervene to create commerce and to do all the other acts and things which other states may rightfully do. Now this strikes me as fairly contrary to the historiography. The Declaration was a complaint not that the British imperial state was too big, but that it had done too little since the accession of George III. It was a call for big government, for activist government, to replace the kind of activist government that the British had been in the 1740s, 1750s. It was not anti-colonial, but a plea for a different kind of empire, which is why 26 of the 32 sermons delivered to celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence between 1776 and 1778 say that the Declaration of Independence had created an American empire. So it wasn't anti-colonial. It was about patriot political economy. From Admiral Vernon to George Washington to the signers of the Declaration, there was a commitment to patriot political economy. And that was not the political economy of small government, but of state support for migration, immigration, state support for opening markets for manufacturers, state support for development, and state support for the suppression of slavery. So why then revolt against the British Empire in favor of British government and the British Constitution? It's because in the views of the Patriots, Grenville and his friends had transformed Britain from a state that pursued development in favor of a state that pursued colonial extraction. And this, in their view, was contrary to the British Constitution. So the Declaration of Independence was trying to restore a state that would support development. It was not anti-colonial or anti-imperial. Instead, what they wanted to do was to create an American patriot empire. And that's it. Sure, sure.
Yeah. So, given what we know now, immediately after the revolution ends, there are acrimonious debates about the fundamentals of what an American political economy should be. Right. What kind of accounts for the fact that there was some sort of consensus during the revolution? Did they honestly think that there was going to be no debate about fundamentals of political economy after the country had gained independence, or was there just kind of a temporary truce about what they could agree upon, and then they would set aside those other fundamental issues arguments until after? What was?
Right. I mean, so this is so. I don't know if everybody could hear. Should I repeat the question? Yeah. I mean, so the question was about, we know after 1783 there are pretty fundamental debates about the nature of America, of what the political economy of the new republic was going to be. How do we explain this consensus beforehand? Well, the argument that I would make is that, in fact, the differences between, say, Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians was not fundamentally in their interpretation of political economy, but fundamentally in their interpretation of American history. And let me explain what I mean by that. Both Hamilton and Jefferson, and I'm using them to stand in for huge numbers of others, believed very much in the sort of patriot political economic program, but they were also both children of the Enlightenment. They believed that there were stages of human history, that human society started off as primitive, there was no society, then they would join and become hunters and gatherers, and the next stage was agrarian, and then the highest stage was commercial. Hamilton believed that America had reached the stage in which that America was becoming a commercial society. Jefferson believed that America was more primitive. It was still at the agrarian stage. And so the argument was not about political economy per se. They both believed they had identical prescriptions for what European states, commercial states, should do in terms of political economy, and criticized what they were doing from that perspective. Their criticisms of European policy were virtually identical. What they disagreed about is what America should do, what was appropriate for its stage of human development. And those issues, those differences became manifest when they started to govern. But if you look at what they said about patriot political economy before the Revolution, they were exactly on the same page. Hamilton, I mean, we know Hamilton's early pamphlets, and we know Jefferson's early pamphlets make almost identical arguments in a variety of ways. Is that other questions? Dr. Kinkle.
So you have the image of the trustees of Georgia meeting with the Yamasee Indians. You've been talking a lot about encouraging immigration, which would seem to maybe have an impact on the people who are already living there. And you've been talking about the French encircling the British colonies and threatening them. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the patriot view of Native American policy overlaps with or connects with the official British administration view on Native American policy.
Right. So there's a spectrum of beliefs in the Second Continental Congress about Native Americans. It's become very fashionable recently to say that everybody in the Second Continental Congress wanted to eviscerate Native Americans. In fact, this is interesting. This is a story which is almost invariably told by people who don't actually study Native American history. It's people who study white people who say this. But it turns out that the patriot position, including somebody like George Washington, is the best example of this. George Washington was somebody who famously invested in Western lands, and which meant, you can only invest in Western lands by buying the lands, taking the lands from Indians, right? So that meant all that. But Washington clearly had a much more kind of developmental view about Indians. So his view was that Indians were also, and this also turns on the stadial view of history, he believes that Indians were, many Indian tribes, and again, he focuses mostly on northern Indians, not on the Cherokee, for example, were on the brink of becoming good agrarian polities. And so his view was what you want to do, the way to encourage them to become agrarian, that is to say, move up from being hunter-gatherers to being agrarian peoples, was to actually have colonists live among them. Now, there's some self-serving in this, there's no question about this, but he legitimately thought that this kind of interaction was the best possible way to promote the happiness, and these were words that he used over and over again in his correspondence in the 1790s of Indians, was to promote their sort of civilization, to move them up one or two ranks on the developmental chain. Now, there were other people without question, who thought, Indians were completely irredeemable. The only thing you could do was to sort of, they could never be civilized in a variety of ways. So there were disagreements, but most of the patriots sort of took this view. Now, interestingly, the British in the 1770s, anyway, the British governmental line had been also to protect Indians in a certain kind of way, but they thought the best way to do this was through segregation. The proclamation line of 1763, although never actually enforced, the idea was, this is where you guys are, we're over here. So there was this notion of kind of separation. Now, it also talked, that position also argued for the dignity of Indians, right? But it didn't argue for the possibility of civilizing the Indians. Now, there was a debate in British circles about this. Now, Sir William Johnson, who was a key figure in New York, who actually marries into an Indian family, et cetera, lives in Indian country. Johnson believed that, in fact, Indians could be civilized exactly in the way that Washington thought so, but his arguments, we know, were rejected when they were presented to George Grenville in 1764. So there's a spectrum of beliefs about this. The basic British policy under Grenville and North was segregation. Washington thought the best possibility to improve Indians, to civilize them, was to live among them. And there were other people in both Britain and North America who thought that the Indians were hopelessly irredeemable. And that becomes the standard British government position with respect to Canada in the 1820s and 1830s. So there's all sorts of arguments that go on. There's this huge ethnographic debate when the British are settling in the South Pacific about whether the Maori, for example, are like North American Indians or are more civilized, and basically the government decides the Maori, in fact, are commercial people, and therefore are dignified, unlike those primitive people who live in Canada. So there's this big debate, which, I mean, this is this remarkable debate. In the House of Commons in 1845, there's a 3-day debate on the ethnography of indigenous peoples. Could you imagine Congress having such a debate in 2017? I mean, could you imagine most of our congressmen pronouncing the word ethnography? I don't know, but there it is. Yeah.
What can you tell me in the argument of people like Jefferson who thought that America was in this more agricultural stage? What was the cost that they made? How was his sort of justification for that? If the country got it wrong and maybe it's a commercial focus, what did he say that happened?
Oh, corruption. I mean, endless corruption, right? I mean, so so the argument, so Jefferson's argument is, and the argument of Jeffersonians is that the future, the immediate future of North America, because it's an agrarian state, involved cheap land, high wages, right? And the reason why cheap land and high wages needed to go together is that they needed people that buy this land, so you needed high wages to attract people into North America. And he thought that was the best possibility. They would virtuously settle. I mean, they would be the sort of language of that we sort of now associate with kind of civic humanism. That they would settle this land. They would become good gentlemen farmers and become sort of more civilized. Now, if you jumped the stage, if you went to commercial society first, you would get what we would call rampant commercialism, crass materialism, the kinds of luxurious living that had destroyed and corrupted Europe. I mean, that was the language which Jefferson used. And of course, increasingly for Jefferson, the best example of what happens if you jump to the stage of commercial society too soon is an example of what Britain looked like in the late 18th century. So Jefferson went from being an incredible Anglophile as a young man, thinking that Britain was the most advanced place in the world, to saying, no, in fact, the reason why Britain did all these horrible things in the 1760s, 1770s, why they continue to do horrible things in the 1790s, is because of this corrupt, crass, materialist society. They have become commercial. They have thought that they were much further along the stages of development than they actually were. And that leads to corruption. And so then, there's a kind of analysis, a ready-to-hand analysis of what corrupt societies look like.
Did Jefferson think that if you continued on this agricultural thing and you worked it long enough, it would be possible to sort of...
Oh, yes. No. I mean, Jefferson believed, just like Adam Smith believed, that there were stages of human society, and once the society matures, then you can become... He didn't believe that commercial society was always bad. It was just premature commercial society led to huge inequalities, led to oligarchies, horrible oligarchies in a variety of ways, and to corrupt societies. So he didn't, I don't think, and I think it's pretty clear from stuff that he's written that he didn't think that commercial societies were ineluctably bad. He just thought the premature commercial societies led to crass materialism. So what you needed to do was to go through the agrarian phase and mature first. Yeah?
Could you comment on Lord Dunmore's foray to the Ohio Territory and how that played a part in Grenville's attempt to subjugate the colonial empire? Could you comment?
Yeah, on Dunmore, I got that. What was the last one?
How that was intended to help subjugators convert the colonial empire at the time to the British in control of the colonies?
Right. Dunmore... Dunmore is a really interesting figure, right? Dunmore, I don't know if, you probably all know, right, these famous portraits of Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore is invariably portrayed wearing a plaid, right? Why he's portrayed wearing a plaid? So the plaid was prescribed. It was illegal to wear the plaid. Here's this British royal governor wearing the plaid. What did this mean? Well, wearing the plaid was a sign of Jacobitism. And the argument here was, and this is a long way around at answering this question, was that George III was the real Jacobite king, that he was the patriot king, he'd been educated by Jacobites. The perception of Dunmore and his ilk was that they were finally going to be pursuing these kind of Jacobite policies. Now, I'd have to go deep back into British history to explain that. What's a Jacobite? A Jacobite is somebody who opposes the Revolution of 1688 in favor of the House of Stuart. And so the Scots Highlanders, like Lord Dunmore, wore this. So Dunmore's idea, as the idea of the Jacobites had been, was that when you deal with political dissent in a variety of ways, you want to militarize. You want to put it down by militarizing the country. His view was the best way to deal with these American upstarts was to seize more Indian land, justify increase of the military, move the discontented onto these sort of frontier, those people complaining, onto these frontier barriers, onto these free country, and onto these new areas. And one of two things were going to happen, both of which were good. Either the Indians would kill them, great, or they would, settle the land and become civilized people by being agrarian development and sort of give up their silly, discontented ways. So that was kind of Dunmore's strategy, and that was very much sort of a piece with the kind of political economic strategy of North's government.
So I want to go back to the question of land. So that was one of the main tenets of this Patriot corollary, I think you said, towards the middle, and this fear of French invasion on British lands. So my first question is, what is the evidence that there was French threat of invasion, like back towards the East Coast, and then why does it disappear towards like the later part of asserting a patriot viewpoint? Like land doesn't really come up towards the end.
Oh, so they weren't. So their concern wasn't so much land. It was, land and they didn't want. The Patriots weren't focused so much on land. They were focused on commerce, on trade. But they didn't want to lose. They didn't want to be driven into the sea either. So what was the evidence that the French were attacking? Well, the evidence is manifest. So they're convinced. And they're right. So in the 1730s, right? There's French Louisiana, where some people are from, and down there in the south, and then there's French Canada there in the north. And in the 1720s and 1730s, the French start building forts along the Mississippi. They start making alliances with key Indian tribes, like the Choctaw. The Choctaw start raiding South Carolina on the orders, or on the orders of probably paid for by the French. The French set up these various forts, and they set up Mobile, Alabama. Mobile, it was supposed to be the advanced the front line of the French invasionary force. And why do we know this is true? Well, we know this is true for two reasons. We know this. We certainly know that the British thought this was the case, because this is repeated over and over again in the South Carolina Gazette, the North Carolina Gazette, in Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, in the North American newspapers, and the West Indian newspapers. The British certainly thought this was true. But it turns out, if you take an hour-and-a-half trip to Columbus, there are the papers of the Comte de Maurepas in the Ohio State Library. And it outlines very clearly, so the Comte de Maurepas is one of the leading ministers, it outlines clearly the plans in the 1730s for the French to drive the British into the sea. So both French archival material indicates this is the case, the British thought this was, the British North Americans thought this was the case, and I can assure you that there are thousands of pages in the National Archives in London describing what they thought the French plans were. And so when I was sitting in Ohio State reading these things, I thought, okay, these guys aren't just paranoid. This isn't American paranoid style. This is a reality, right? This was a real French plan. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk on historiography at the beginning, but there was a name that was missing that I thought would be fun to bring up. Gary Nash. I think that he would probably criticize this for being very top-down history. Not very bottom up. What kind of evidence is there, if there's any, of sort of the lower sorts taking on this patriot cause? Because from what Nash is saying, it's more of like, in the port cities, it's more of a fight against accumulation of wealth.
Right.
Rather than these other type of arguments that mainland wood and green product.
Yeah. So Gary Nash, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of value in what Gary Nash has written. Gary Nash, Europe doesn't exist for Gary Nash, right? There is, Britain, exists as kind of like this fairy tale place. It's like Narnia. It might or might not exist, and there might or might not be a lion or a witch or maybe a wardrobe. But it doesn't play a very large role in the story, right? So in fact, he provides the evidence that the lower orders. So he provides, he provides a real evidence for this in a variety of cases. So he just isn't sort of alive to it. So for example, in Boston, the sort of leader, the leader of the Sons of Liberty that Gary Nash talks about in Boston is a guy. He names his son Pasquale Paoli. Now that's a very typical, right, English-sounding name that you would, that somebody like Thomas Meredith would call his son. Why does he call him Pasquale Paoli? Well, he calls himself Pasquale Paoli because everybody, and there's this place, there was a Battle of Paoli in the Revolutionary War, and it wasn't just, they didn't sort of make it up, it's because there was this place called Paoli, Pennsylvania, which you still go to if you travel out on the main line, right, in Philadelphia. It was called Pasquale Paoli because Paoli was not only Napoleon Bonaparte's hero, he was the hero of the British Patriots in the 1760s and 1770s. Paoli was a Corsican patriot who led a rebellion against Genoa, but mostly against France, to create an independent Corsican republic. The Patriots are urging the Grenville government to take action, to support Paoli, to support Republicans. Grenville gives a speech in the House of Commons describing Republicans and republicanism as this cancer on the earth. And, by the way, we've got this budget crisis. We can't spend any money, saving these guys. So the French invade. They take Corsica, and the rest is history, or at least it becomes even more history when Napoleon Bonaparte becomes Emperor of France. But Americans see this, the reason why a Boston Son of Liberty would call his son Pasquale Paoli is because it's precisely evidence that Grenville, because of his austerity measures, was not supporting the kind of empire of liberty. And now Corsica was very important in the Patriot imagination because Corsica was key to trading in the Mediterranean, so you could export manufactured goods to Mediterranean ports if Corsica supported. So you support republicanism, you're also supporting commercial exports. So this vision, and we know that this is what the North Americans thought, that this guy in Boston thought about this, because this is exactly what the radical Boston newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy, so this is the newspaper which is associated with the radical patriots, his sort of plebeians in Gary Nash's story. This is how they describe the Corsican events. And they do this not once, not twice, but 58 times in 1766 to 1768. Now, this doesn't figure in Gary Nash's story. Why? Because Europe is Narnia. Why do you want to write about Narnia in your, it doesn't figure. So the point is that I think he's right that these sort of issues, these social and economic issues matter. But these social and economic issues cannot be divorced from these larger imperial issues. They fit together. You have to understand that they saw themselves not as Americans until 1774 or 1775, but as British Americans, and they saw this, the Patriot cause, as the cause of Britons or British patriots everywhere. So it was a political economic program that was pan-imperial, not narrowly North American. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
The big question, the big point, right?
Yeah.
Which is that the early revolutionaries were in favor of big government. And I make a really compelling case that they're in favor of a bigger government than what we usually attribute to them. I wonder whether there's still aspects of that more standard narrative. We think about the standing army question. We think about some of the other things that the rights discourse emerges in response to that still may hold up. After your otherwise devastating attack on all of those, folks who make the argument that it was really And I'm thinking in particular of like Max Edling's view that it takes kind of a constitution for Americans to rediscover the desirability of having a strong government.
Yeah.
Suggesting that maybe they hadn't quite gotten there in 1770s.
Right. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of Max. I'm always in favor of Swedes writing American history. This is a good thing. Is it surprising that a Swede would say that big government have? But, the problem with Max's story, and this is also, the problem with Jack Rakow's story, is that they don't spend a lot of time actually reading what the Second Continental Congress does, right? And this is a remarkable thing. And of course, your supervisor, when he talks about what the Second Continental Congress does, all he wrote about were disputes among states over boundary lines, right? And that doesn't make the state look very big. But what does the Continental Congress do? It calls on, so it's a sort of call and response. It tells the states, we need to start manufacturing things like textiles. So the states start manufacturing textiles. It says you need to raise money to subsidize the textiles. So the states start doing this. So it's not the states acting on their own, which is the way it looked in Jack Green's story, because they only looks at individual states. But it's a call and response from the Second Continental Congress. So, some of the stuff that they call for them to do are things that, Edling would predict, right? I mean, they call for them to make gunpowder, right? I mean, that's what Max would say. But it's not just a fiscal military state. They're also calling for doing all sorts of things like building roads to improve commerce during the war, right? So my view is that, the Second Continental Congress does an incredible amount of stuff. So when the Declaration of Independence says that the new government should establish commerce, that's pretty strong language, and they do it. The Second Continental Congress does it. And so I think, if I were to set an undergraduate thesis student or, a graduate student on a sort of new project, it would actually be to ask the sort of questions that Max asks of the early republic of what's actually going on, what the Second Continental Congress is actually doing during the war. And I think it's doing a lot of state-like activities. It's state activities. And it's doing so with a sort of coordinated activity between the Congress and the newly founded state governments. So I think from that perspective, it looks, pretty activist. But your point about the standing army, I sort of take. I don't disagree with. I think there are certain areas. When I say that they want an activist government, it doesn't mean that they want a big government in every sort of way. And there are certain limits, and there are 18th century contours of that argument.